Welcome back to The Explainer. Grab a seat. Today, we're stepping right into the military classroom, pulling out our hand-drawn operational maps and looking closely at the 1962 Sino-Indian War. Specifically, we're breaking down Operation Leghorn. This is a pretty devastating case study of what actually happens when grand political ambition violently collides with raw, unforgiving geography. Right off the bat, we run into this massive strategic dilemma. Can intention replace preparation? See, in late 1961, New Delhi issued what was called the Forward Policy Directive. Basically, it was an order for Indian troops to aggressively push up to the disputed McMahon line and physically assert control over the frontier. But there was a fatal disconnect here, right? A huge gap between the comfortable, heated rooms where these lines are being drawn and the freezing, oxygen-deprived reality where soldiers actually had to stand their ground. So let's contrast those two realities. Now, if we look at the tactical board and trace the pencil lines on our strategic map of the Towing sector, the geographical isolation is just, well, it's mind-boggling. Imagine having to trace this exact route entirely on foot. You're starting way down at the bottom in Taiwan, winding your way up through these unforgiving, jagged mountains to Lumpu, descending incredibly sharply into the Namkachu River Valley, and then finally staring straight up at the towering, heavily defended Thagla Ridge. Honestly, just mapping the topography reveals the immense scale of the logistical nightmare the military was walking into. Tawang, Lumpu, Namkachu, Thagla. Getting to these remote frontiers wasn't a matter of hopping in a transport truck. We are talking about weeks of grueling trekking through hostile, completely roadless terrain. And once the troops actually got there, maintaining them became nearly impossible. Airdrop capacity was incredibly primitive at the time, so soldiers were forced to rely on local porters, or literally carry everything on their own backs, just to survive the harsh environment, let alone actually fight a war. All of this logistical chaos really comes to a head in June 1962 with the establishment of the Dola Post. Manned by a small Assam Rifles platoon, this isolated forward post acted as the detonator for the entire conflict. And tactically speaking, it was a total disaster. It was completely dominated by the Thagla Heights right above it, making it entirely indefensible. Local commanders were desperately sending warnings, saying, hey, this is practically a death trap. Yet unyielding political directives demanded that the post be held at all costs. And I think this perfectly illustrates the fatal flaw of Operation Leghorn. It's classic hubris versus reality. On one hand, you have the political objective demanding that the military evict an entrenched opponent and enforce the forward policy, by force if necessary. But on the other hand, the ground reality was handing them severe terrain disadvantages and massive logistical weaknesses. Basically, Delhi was demanding decisive military action without providing the artillery, the secure supply lines, or frankly, even the time required to back it up. 400, that's it. That number represents the mere 400 bayonets available in units like the Gorkhas and Rajputs when they were hurriedly marshaled to the front lines. Now, keep in mind, these specific battalions were authorized for 800 men. They were deployed at half strength, sent into freezing, high-altitude environments wearing only summer clothing. They were carrying only the ammunition that fit in their pouches, completely short on basic digging tools, and expected to fight an impossible battle against a heavily fortified adversary. When you compare the actual military preparations, the asymmetry is just staggering. Look at the Chinese forces. They had been preparing in earnest since May 1962. They methodically built a 7-ton capacity road just hours from the Thagla Ridge, properly acclimatized their troops to the extreme altitude, and established well-stocked forward supply dumps. Meanwhile, the Indian forces were caught in this frantic last-minute scramble, entirely reliant on erratic airdrops and summer gear. The Chinese commander was operating on cold logistical reality, while the Indian forces were forced to operate on sheer political hope. Now, realizing a direct frontal assault against the ridge would be completely suicidal, the newly appointed Corps commander, Lieutenant General Call, pivoted to a theoretical maneuver called positional warfare. The idea here was to occupy tactical positions to force the opponent to withdraw without a direct fight. So he essentially wanted to march severely under-equipped Indian troops behind entrenched Chinese lines. Why? Largely to appease political bosses in Delhi by proving the army was quote-unquote doing something. But the guys actually on the ground, they were not having it. Local commanders fiercely protested these sort of theoretical classroom tactics. Brigadier Dalvi, commander of the 7th Infantry Brigade, stated it incredibly bluntly. He said, "In the mountains, administration is the critical principle of war. The burden of porterage was a serious embarrassment." These on-the-ground commanders deeply understood a very simple truth. You cannot execute complex positional warfare when your men are literally starving and freezing. Basic stockpiling was being completely ignored right before pushing these troops directly into the line of fire. So, the tragic reality of this forced deployment left the 7th Brigade helplessly tethered to the Namkachu River line. Picture this. You're strung out thinly along the valley floor, connected only by incredibly fragile log bridges, and you have absolutely zero room for maneuver. And worst of all, you are completely overlooked by deeply entrenched Chinese forces holding the undisputed high ground on the Thogla Heights right above you. Stripped of all tactical advantage, the brigade was practically just waiting for the inevitable. And sadly, the inevitable arrived. The breaking point came on October 10th at the Tsungjiang clash. At 0800 hours, an ill-equipped 9 Punjab platoon managed to heroically repulse an initial Chinese attack. But by 0930, a second attack hit, and Indian troops were already running perilously low on their limited pouch ammunition. Finally, at 1200 hours, a full Chinese battalion of 800 heavily armed men launched a devastating three-sided assault. Overwhelming force and intense preparation simply shattered the desperately under-equipped Indian positions. So, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a stark, immovable lesson from the Himalayas. Operational success requires matching aims with capability. What really happens when political ambition completely ignores the cold, hard ground truth? Well, in Operation Leghorn, the tragic answer was etched right into the terrain itself. It is a timeless, unforgiving reminder that logistics and terrain must dictate strategy, not the other way around. Thanks so much for joining me on this analysis. What do you think happens when we forget these lessons today? Think about it, and I'll see you next time as we continue to map out the realities behind the history.